Okay, thanks everyone for joining for my talk. Today I'm going to be talking about the project that was funded by the Connected Everything Feasibility Study 2, which is the design and manufacture of novel 3D printed electrodes. And first I'll introduce the team. So there's myself, the project investigator. I worked on all of the projects, but generally overseeing and managing all of the projects on the RAs. And then we have Hosni, who was a research associate working on the 3D printing, carbonization and fuel cell testing. And then we have Kiatana, where she was working on the neural network modeling for this project. And so the challenge with electrodes in electrochemical devices is that the materials interact with flow, species transport, electron transport, two-phase flow, and these are all affected by the solid microstructure, as you can see by this image here. It can be a complex stochastic arrangement of solid particles. So the idea is, can we rearrange the solid microstructure to optimize the performance of these transport processes, which means you essentially get the oxygen to your catalyst at a higher concentration, or you remove your products easier from your reaction sites. And this isn't specific to fuel cells, it could be related to electrolyzers, batteries, or anything like that. And there's a couple of examples. Generally, these are simulation examples. So a redox flow battery discharge. On the figure seen here, you want to be as high as you can on this figure. So the black line is what you would get if you use a ordered structured material for a gas diffusion layer in a redox flow battery. And if you replace the traditional materials, you can get about 38% increase in power density. And again, the same for a fuel cell. The 3D printed is the line above the orange line. And what that essentially means is you're getting more energy as you put more throughput through the device compared to if you're using the traditional carbon paper type material, which is something like you're seeing on the left here by this reconstruction of the carbon paper. And so there's some motivation there to say that potentially if you could design and manufacture a new type of microstructure, then you might be able to improve the performance of different electrochemical devices. And so there's a couple of challenges that I was looking to address. Firstly is, could I design a framework to optimize the microstructure without human input? Because previously we just decided that a cubic lattice arrangement, because it has straight pathways, is the best microstructure for these purposes, but it might not be. Also, can machine learning be used to assist the speed of some of these characterizations or simulations? So, for example, using a neural network for image classification rather than using the simulations to classify the image. And then another part of this was understanding what are the limitations of additive manufacturing tools. So the current stereolithography printing and the software associated with that, how can they be integrated more with the design process? And then again, it's about trying to prove the performance of some of these materials in real electrochemical cells. So the initial plan was to have 3 projects which were interdisciplinary, so a physics-based prediction package, so that's essentially physics and engineering, a design phase, which is developing a genetic algorithm to optimize microstructure, so that's more of a computer science aspect, and then manufacturing, so 3D printing the output of this algorithm which designs the microstructure directly to the printing, and then be able to test that in an electrochemical cell. And because of various timelines and things like that, then obviously we made progress and built foundation on all of these things, but I'll show you the results from each of these sections in this talk. So to start off with, what I needed was a physics-based simulation which would characterize an image of some type of porous material. So an example here is solving the Laplace equation. We're using the finite volume method inside the pore space of this 2-dimensional porous structure, where the black circles represents the solid particles and the white space in the box around is the pore space or the void space where species can diffuse through that space. And the black solids essentially resist species diffusion from one side of the material to the other, and you want to try and minimize that resistance. And it's not just about porosity, it's also about the arrangement of the particles. And so essentially how I did this is just showing a one-dimensional implementation, but it's a fully 3D implementation, which I coded in MATLAB. And essentially you solve the fixed law of diffusion over each face, and then you do a species balance inside each volume of your pore space, and then you can convert that into a linear matrix form, which you can solve with linear solvers at steady state to actually get the concentration distribution within the microstructure. So the colors that you see in here is I set a concentration of 1 on the left and a concentration of 0 on the right. And then by solving the Laplace equation, you get the distribution of the concentration inside the microstructure. And from that, you can essentially use Fick's law again to get the average flux over this structure, which then you can convert back into this dE here, which is the effective diffusivity. And that tells you how good your material is inside that block at conducting species, so chemical species, through that material. And what we want to do is we want to try and optimize that material. And so for those cubic lattices that I described before, I analytically derived the diffusivity for the cubic lattice, which means that we can know what the value should be, so I can test this model I built to see how accurate it is. And so the analytical equation is the black line, and the blue dots are the prediction from this numerical model at a range of different porosities. And as you can see, there's a fairly good agreement between the analytical and the volume of fluid method that the finite volume method that I made in MATLAB. And you can see it's getting close to the theoretical maximum at any porosity, which is the dashed line. And now this red line, which I've also plotted on there, that's actually the effective diffusivity for carbon paper material, which is used in many electrochemical cells. And as you can see, this type of cubic lattice is actually a couple times higher than the traditional materials. So if we can't optimize the material, we know that the lattice type structures should be reasonably well. And so, as I was saying before, the maximum theoretical diffusivity, what is it for a microstructure? In something like this in 3D, it actually ends up being a straight line. So the material will arrange itself in a straight line for the most optimal shape for this type of simulation, because that's the minimum shape that will result in the highest effective diffusivity of this structure. And so I tested the model to see the speed of the model at different resolutions. So as I increase the resolution, you go from half a second for a 50 by 50 grid size, but you don't resolve the structure that well, to 20 seconds per simulation for a 300 by 300 grid size. And now it's important to have this fast simulation because I can just give it an image now and it will be able to predict and characterize in seconds what is the performance of that structure, which we can move through to the genetic algorithm in the next phase. And so the genetic algorithm was used for structure optimization, and I had to code this genetic algorithm from scratch because there wasn't a very well working pixel-based genetic algorithm for this type of problem. So you start with an initial population, which is a set of randomized material microstructures. You then compute the diffusion simulation like I showed before, using the model I showed before. I then select the two best parents using a roulette wheel selection. So the best performing structures get selected. And then through some customized crossover mutation algorithms, you essentially merge together or cross over the two parents to create a set of children microstructures, which you again loop back around to the simulation and keep repeating this until some type of optimal microstructure evolves from this algorithm. And we can see this algorithm actually working here. So I've just got it to loop the video here. So without any human input from myself, this structure optimizes itself to close to the theoretical maximum, whilst also constraining the porosity. So the porosity stays constant at 70% here. So that's a constraint in the system to try not to remove any solid particles. And as you can see, over 40 generations, we move from 0.4 to around 0.65 effective diffusivity. And I can show this again for different starting conditions and different algorithm parameters. You can see how the algorithm will evolve the simulation into essentially a straight line, because that is the most optimal shape for this type of simulation here. And this is without me having to do any human input. This just runs by itself. So to make it more complex, I then added a reaction source term, just an arbitrary reaction source term on the surfaces of the particles, where I forgot to mention the white parts are the solid particles in this instance, and the color around it is the concentration field. And by implementing a reaction source term, well, it's actually a sync term, then I can tell the algorithm to instead optimize for reaction rate, which is this blue line here. And as you can see, this is what the microstructure evolves to over the generations. And again, another type of the same simulation, but just different initial conditions. And you can see that, again, yes, it will optimize the reaction rate in blue whilst trying to maintain a very constant porosity across the generations. So this kind of simulation here took about 5 minutes, so it can run pretty fast if your simulation is fast. So that was an overview of the genetic algorithm that Woods developed. There's a couple of things that needs to be gone further with this. So particularly developing new mutation and crossover algorithms for the structure conversion to increase the jump in the optimized property per generation. So because our simulations will likely be more complex and take a long time, we want the jump in the property per generation to be larger, so we don't use too much computational time. And I would also like to couple this to more advanced simulation codes, such as OpenFOAM, for different flow, electrochemistry, and things like that. And then also extend the framework to 3 dimensions, which then you can take that 3D voxel grid and then send that directly to a 3D printer to be printed for testing afterwards. And so I briefly mentioned that some of these complex simulations, physics-based models, could be computationally expensive. And so I wanted to kind of answer the feasibility question of, can machine learning be used to predict the diffusivity without the simulations? And now you still need the simulations to train the network on. So I generated 5,000 diffusion simulations and images from the first project to train the neural network. And then Kiyotana built a neural network which could take the input image, so just the raw binary image of the microstructure, and then through the neural network be able to predict the effective diffusivity without a simulation. And with that, we were able to get within a 97% accuracy, with more details in the full report if you're interested. Some unanswered questions which we're still working towards is, what is the minimum training data required for a good prediction? Because obviously complex simulations are slow. What's the minimum we can get away with for a reasonable accuracy prediction? And does also this work for a lot more complex physical phenomena, which is still unanswered? And so the fourth part of the project was the manufacturing side of things, so the 3D printing and fuel cell testing. And now, because we were testing the feasibility, the optimization algorithm didn't produce a structure which we could actually print as of yet. So we took the lattice, the cubic lattice structures, which we knew would have some kind of improved performance and are easy to produce and manufacture for taking forward for testing the feasibility of manufacturing these materials. And so using the porous microstructure generator, which is a software that I've been working on, you can generate a cubic lattice of any size and shape with pore sizes and pore diameters of any size and shape that you choose. And then it will generate the digital geometry and then send that to the 3D printing software, which can then slice and print the materials. And as you can see by these images here, sometimes when you're trying to print large macro scale materials with micro scale features, you can actually introduce kind of memory limits onto your structure because, for example, a 5 by 5 centimeter piece of this material was about 600 gigabytes per meter squared of this material. So if you were printing larger sizes to go into commercial scale electrolyzers, fuel cells, which are meters in scale, then you'd have to address the memory limits of traditional surface files. And if you go through a process of 3D printing and carbonization, then you can get to sizes of around 100 micron pore size diameter and around about 25 micron fiber diameter for these cubic lattice structures. And these were able to preserve the microstructure features of turning a polymer into a carbon structure, which is needed to conduct electrons in this material. And how we did that was by carbonization. So based on the thermogravimetric analysis, so that's the decomposition rate of the photopolymer that's printed, we can work out what's the furnace temperature profile, which is shown on the bottom left there, which will minimize the structural damage of these materials. So on the images, the column of images in the middle there, that is the 3D printed materials. And then the column of images on the right, that's the same materials but carbonized. And what happens is the material shrinks by about 50%. But as you can also see, a lot of the microstructural features are preserved during this process. So we're able to convert a photopolymer into a carbon microstructure, which then we can try and test. And now in collaboration with Adrian from the Eindhoven University, we were able to get some X-ray computed tomography samples of this material. And what we actually found is there were some defects in the printing process, which introduced these parallel walls, which was to do with the orientation of the printing. But we didn't know that at the time before we got these X-ray CT samples quite late on in the project. We've since amended this problem and we've got a new material to use, but the results I'm showing here are generally with this type of material. And so with the fuel cell testing, so Osni worked on this part and he converted the 3D structure into a carbon material. He applied PTFE treatment to get it to be hydrophobic for the water which is transported in this material. And then he coated the catalyst layer onto one side of the material. And then he tested various methods of applying this new gas diffusion layer into the membrane electrode assembly of a fuel cell. And he found that using a single-sided catalyst-coated membrane approach was the best to reduce hydrogen crossover in these materials. And now it's still kind of ongoing work, the testing of these materials, but what we found is the materials are quite brittle. The initial ones I showed with the defects with the walls, and I've highlighted here in red lines. When the cell was compressed, you can see that the walls have collapsed onto each other in a diagonal kind of arrangement, and that's obviously something we don't want to happen. We want to preserve the structure, and you can see actually the cracks from the flow field appearing on the images on the right here, and that's where the compression has essentially cracked these materials. But we have improved that, so using a new type of resin, which is a different photopolymer, we've actually improved that now, and we don't get those effects. And compared to previous work where I've used a 3D printed material, I had high hydrogen crossover due to membrane damage. In this work, we've now been able to get the crossover of hydrogen, which is indicated by these lines on these figures on the left. It's the same as the commercial GDL material now, so we've improved that. And there's some indication that the 3D printed material may be performing better than the carbon paper, as shown by the image on the right here, which essentially shows at a constant potential, so 0.6 volts, what is the current density you get from the device. And the 3D printed material is almost double than the commercial gas diffusion layer material. So it produces double the amount of reaction rate at the same potential. And it appears to not have as sharp of a drop in the current due to water flooding, which you see after 50 minutes. So there is some indication there that the material is performing better, but we still need to do more tests. And we should have a paper on this possibly out next year, but we need to get some more fuel cell testing done. So to kind of conclude the talk, we've proved that the 3D printed material can perform on par with commercial materials in terms of the hydrogen crossover and potentially the performance. And we've created fast physics-based models for image characterization. I've also created a prototype genetic algorithm to optimize the 2D image based on a model that you give it. And I've created new digital algorithms to reconstruct the 3D geometry and tested the limits of the 3D printing at large scales, as well as manufacturing, carbonization, and tested in fuel cells, which the work is continuing right now. We've also had a oral presentation at the Electrochemical Society conference in Gothenburg, Sweden, and that was back in October. So Hosni presented his work on the fuel cells in that conference. I've also used the findings of this to build a foundation for the Royal Academy of Engineering Fellowship, which I submitted back in September. And I've started collaborations with Eindhoven University and Simon Fraser University based on the work that I've started here. I was also invited to a talk at ULIT's Research Centre, which I gave in September 2023, which was a kind of spin out from this work. And some of the updates and contributions have been put into the Porous Microstructure Generator software, which is the free software which you're able to download. And as you can see here, this is just an illustration of the software and the different types of materials that it can produce with its user interface here. And these are some of the examples of some of the materials and microstructures that you can generate with this software. So I'd like to finish there and thank everyone for listening